A millionaire mocked a poor man by giving him a dying horse. But what that man did next made the whole town go silent. No one in San Marlo ever forgot the day a broke, dust-covered man walked away from the town fair leading a horse too broken to live. They laughed at him, called it charity, called it madness. But months later, when that same horse returned, strong and proud beside the man everyone had thrown away, no one dared to laugh again. The highway cut through the Texas desert like a faded scar, stretching under a sky the color of rust. A dry wind scraped against the earth, carrying sand that stung the eyes and whispered through the ribs of abandoned gas stations. A man pushed a dented metal cart along the shoulder of the road. Its wheels squeaked, its shadow thin and uneven across the dust. His name was Ethan Cole, once a blacksmith, now a drifter who gathered scrap metal and silence in equal measure. The smell of oil still lived in his clothes, though the forge that once sang with sparks had long been buried by foreclosure and time. His boots were cracked, his hands calloused from years of shaping horseshoes, yet his gaze held something stubborn, like an ember that refused to die. He paused to take a drink from a sun-warped bottle, then looked toward the horizon, where a cluster of white tents shimmered. A sign half swallowed by sand read, "Annual Horse Auction, San Marlo County Fairgrounds." The letters seemed almost mocking against the desolation. From afar came the hum of engines, laughter, and the echo of a loudspeaker. Ethan squinted, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. The world of horse auctions was a ghost from another life, one that still breathed in his chest whenever he smelled hay or leather. He hesitated at the fence line. Beyond it, trucks gleamed under the sun. Men in wide-brimmed hats shook hands, and women in polished boots clinked glasses. It was a festival of privilege, a different planet entirely. The horses were brushed to perfection, tails braided, their coats shimmering like copper. Ethan stood apart, the dust of the desert still on his shoulders, the sun carving deep shadows into the lines of his face. He hadn't seen a living horse up close in nearly 10 years. Not since the fire took his home, and with it the family that once filled his evenings with laughter. The memory flickered like heat on asphalt, the smell of smoke, a child's voice calling from somewhere he couldn't reach, then only silence and flame. He never spoke of it, never would. But whenever he saw a horse's eyes, he felt the echo of what he'd lost. A voice carried over the crowd. "Next up, ladies and gentlemen, a true gem from Davenport Stables." Laughter followed, bright and hollow. Ethan turned and saw a man step into the ring. Charles Davenport, the oil heir whose name was printed on billboards, whose face smiled from charity galas and business magazines. He was young, sharp-suited, with the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. The crowd adored him. Ethan's gaze drifted lower, to the horse being led into the ring. A gray gelding, ribs visible beneath a dull coat, limping slightly on the back leg, its mane tangled, one eye clouded with a milky haze. The handler tugged the rope with irritation, but the horse didn't resist. It had already given up. The announcer's voice grew mocking. "A last-minute addition, folks. Not a show horse, but perhaps a lesson in mercy." The audience chuckled. Charles looked bored. Then, spotting Ethan by the fence, dusty, tired, anonymous, his smile twisted. "I'll buy it," he said, loud enough for the crowd. But not for me, he pointed, his Rolex glinting in the sun. For that man over there, a gift from Davenport Stables. Let him ride his way out of poverty. Laughter broke like glass. Ethan didn't move. His throat tightened, but his eyes stayed calm. The auctioneer hesitated, then struck the gavel. Sold for $50 to the gentleman in the dust. The horse flinched at the sound. Ethan took a slow breath, stepped through the crowd's laughter, and accepted the rope. Up close, the animal smelled of neglect and rainless nights. Its flank quivered under his hand. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. You and I, old boy, look like we've both seen better days. Charles raised his glass. To charity, he shouted, and the crowd roared again. But Ethan didn't look back. He led the limping horse away, the laughter fading behind him, swallowed by the wind. The sun dropped low, painting the world in amber. By the time the fairground noise disappeared, only the creak of the cart's wheels and the uneven rhythm of the horse's steps remained. Ethan didn't know where he was taking it, only that leaving it behind felt wrong. Maybe he saw something in those pale eyes, something too familiar to ignore. When they reached the edge of town, he found an old barn leaning against the horizon, its roof sagging like a tired sigh. Inside, the air smelled of dust and dry hay. He tied the rope loosely to a post, removed the horse's halter, and whispered, Rest here, Ashen. You're safe now. The horse didn't move, but it didn't shy away either. For the first time in years, Ethan felt another heartbeat near his own. Outside, the desert wind rattled the barn walls like distant applause. He sat down beside the stall, his back against the wood, eyes heavy but awake. Somewhere behind him, the horse exhaled, a long, tired breath that filled the dark with life. Ethan smiled faintly in the half-light. Guess it's just you and me now, he murmured. The wind outside shifted, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the fairgrounds, fading, meaningless, already forgotten. Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't know that by morning, the horse's breath would change his own. The morning bled into a dull orange sky. Dust floated through the air like tired ghosts, settling on the roof of the old barn. Ethan Cole woke to the sound of hooves shifting against the dirt floor. The horse, Ashen, as he had named him, stood trembling in a patch of light that filtered through a crack in the boards. One eye was clouded, the other glimmered faintly with life. Ethan rubbed his neck, his body stiff from sleeping against wood. He reached for the tin bucket he'd filled from a nearby trough and pushed it toward the horse. Ashen hesitated, nostrils flaring, then drank, slowly, cautiously, like someone who'd been betrayed before. Ethan watched in silence. He had known men like that, too. By mid-morning, the sound of engines rumbled from the town beyond. The annual fair was still alive, echoing with music and voices. But out here, the world was still. Ethan brushed the horse's flank with a rag, shaking off loose dust. Beneath the grime, the skin was scarred in strange lines, old whip marks, faint but permanent. His jaw tightened. Whoever had owned this animal before didn't deserve the air they breathed. He worked without thinking, as he had once done in the forge. He remembered how steel sang when struck, how sparks leapt like stars. Now only the soft scrape of a brush and the occasional snort of the horse filled the space. It wasn't much, but it was honest. In the afternoon, the barn door creaked open. Ethan turned, squinting against the glare. A man stood there, the light behind him forming a halo of arrogance. Charles Davenport. "Well, look at this," Charles said, stepping inside. The polished leather of his boots sank into the dirt, and he wrinkled his nose. "You really kept it. Thought you might have sold it for scrap." Ethan didn't answer. He kept brushing Ashen's side, steady strokes. Charles chuckled. "Guess I was wrong. Seems you two are bonding. How touching." He ran a finger along a dusty beam and looked at it with distaste. "You know, people are still talking about you. You're quite the entertainment." Ethan finally turned. "Did you come here to laugh again, or just to see what decency looks like up close?" The millionaire's smile faltered. For a second, something passed through his eyes, guilt or the faintest recognition of shame. But it vanished. "You're a funny man," he said. "Don't mistake pity for friendship. I gave you that horse to do you a favor. You looked like you needed one." Ethan took a step forward, the brush still in his hand. "You gave me your trash and called it charity. But out here, trash has a way of finding its purpose again." Charles smirked, though the words hit deeper than he let show. He took out a silver lighter, flicked it open, and lit a cigarette. The smoke curled toward the rafters. "Keep it then," he said, flicking ash to the ground. "Just remember, it's still broken." He turned to leave, but Ashen shifted, stamping his injured leg once, hard. The sudden sound startled Charles enough to freeze mid-step. Ethan didn't move. The horse's good eye locked onto the man in the suit, unblinking. For a heartbeat, the air between them felt heavy, like judgment. Charles hesitated, then stepped outside without another word. His truck roared to life and disappeared in a cloud of dust. Ethan stood in the doorway long after he'd gone. He watched the trail of dirt dissipate into the air, then looked back at the horse. "You scared him," he said quietly. Ashen blinked, almost proud. Later, Ethan walked to town. The sun beat down on cracked pavement, and the smell of gasoline mixed with the sweetness of fried dough from fair vendors. People passed him with the same glances they always did, quick, dismissive. He stopped by a small hardware store, trading a bag of metal scraps for a tin of liniment and a coil of wire. "Still working with horses, Cole?" the clerk asked. "Heard you got one now. The Davenport gift." His voice dripped with amusement. Ethan smiled faintly. "That's right. And one day, that horse might just outlive us all." He left the store before the man could respond. Back at the barn, he mixed the liniment with oil and rubbed it gently into Ashen's leg. The horse shifted, but didn't pull away. Each motion felt like a conversation. Slow, patient, wordless. Outside, the sun sank lower, painting the desert gold. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the quiet hum of purpose. He found an old brush in the corner and combed through Ashen's mane. The horse lowered its head, breathing through its nose softly, the sound calm and steady. "Not so broken after all," Ethan whispered. That night, the wind returned. It slid through the cracks of the barn and tugged at the door. Ethan sat against the wall, watching Ashen sleep, chest rising and falling in rhythm. His own eyes grew heavy. For a moment before sleep took him, he thought about Charles, his perfect suit, his hollow laugh. Somewhere inside that man was the same emptiness Ethan carried for years. Only his was gilded with gold. Before dawn, Ethan woke to the sound of hoofbeats, not frantic, but restless. Ashen was pacing, head turning toward the open desert, ears twitching at the sound of distant thunder. The sky, still dark, began to tremble with low rumblings. A storm was coming. Ethan stood and patted the horse's neck. "Easy," he murmured. "We'll ride it out." Outside, lightning cracked far off beyond the dunes. Ashen's breath came quick and sharp, but Ethan's hand stayed steady. He closed the barn door and sat beside the horse until the sound of thunder faded into the horizon. In the silence that followed, something in both of them shifted. Small, invisible, but real. The barn felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Ashen turned his head slightly, resting his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder. The man exhaled, half in disbelief, half in relief. "You and I," he said softly. "We're just getting started." The rain that never truly came had left the Texas desert coated in a thin skin of dust. By sunrise, the barn glowed faintly in the gold of another dry morning. Ethan stood at the open doorway, a mug of bitter instant coffee cooling in his hand, watching Ashen shift uneasily in the dim light. The horse's ribs still pressed against his skin like the frame of a forgotten house, but his breath had grown steadier. The leg that once trembled with each step now found its balance for a few seconds longer each day. Ethan's life began to form a rhythm again, a kind of quiet schedule carved from necessity. He scavenged metal in the mornings, brought back small earnings from the junkyard, and spent his evenings tending to the horse. The barn smelled of oil, hay, and time. It reminded him of his father's forge when he was young, when life had weight and purpose. The horse didn't need words. He simply listened, his one clear eye fixed on Ethan whenever the man spoke into the empty air. One afternoon, Ethan found a piece of old leather under the workbench. He cut and stitched it into a crude halter, tightening it around Ashen's head with careful hands. The horse flinched once, but did not resist. "That's it," Ethan murmured. "We're not much to look at, but we'll make do." By now, the people in town had begun to notice the strange pair at the edge of the desert. Some called him the hermit with the crippled horse. Others said he was losing his mind. It didn't matter. Ethan had stopped caring about the world's laughter a long time ago. Each time he brushed the dust off Ashen's coat, he thought of the forge, the way raw iron, beaten long enough, could remember how to be strong again. That evening, a knock startled him. It wasn't the sharp rap of authority, but the hesitant rhythm of someone unsure they should even be there. He opened the door to find a woman in a denim jacket and a ponytail of gray-streaked hair. "You're Ethan Cole, right?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I'm Maggie. I run the diner off Route 67. Folks been talking about you and that horse." Ethan's shoulders tightened. "That right?" "Don't worry," she said with a half-smile. "I'm not here to laugh. I just brought leftovers. Chicken and cornbread. Figured you both could use it." He hesitated, then took the warm foil package. "Thanks," he said quietly. "He's not much for cornbread, though." She smiled. "Then I guess that's for you." Her eyes drifted to Ashen, who stood in the stall, watching her curiously. "Poor thing," she whispered. "But he's beautiful, in a way." "Name's Ashen," Ethan said. Maggie nodded. "Ashen. Like the color after fire." The words hung there, too close to truth. He looked away, pretending to tidy the tools. When he turned back, she was already walking toward the fading horizon. That night, as the barn settled into its slow breathing, Ethan sat beside Ashen and unwrapped the cornbread. The smell of butter and Salt filled the small space. He broke a piece in half and left it on the ground for the mouse that lived behind the grain sacks. "Guess she sees more than most," he said, his voice low. "You and me, we're not the ashes. They just think we are." Ashen flicked his ears as though he understood. Days slipped by, and the light changed. The desert's horizon turned redder, sharper. Ethan began guiding the horse outside each morning, leading him to the dry creek bed that stretched behind the barn. The ground was cracked like old leather, but it offered enough space for small steps. Each day, Ashen walked a little farther. Each night, Ethan cleaned his legs with an oil-soaked rag, his hands gentle but sure. One morning, the sound of tires on gravel broke their rhythm. Ethan looked up and saw a black truck stop near the gate. Charles Davenport stepped out, wearing sunglasses and the kind of confidence that looked borrowed. "Well, look at this," he said, walking toward the barn. "My investment's still alive." Ethan said nothing. He adjusted the rope in his hand. Ashen snorted, ears twitching. Charles circled the horse slowly. "Didn't expect it to last this long. Guess you found yourself a project." "Not a project," Ethan replied. "A life." Charles smirked. "Everything's a project to someone like you. Something to fix, something to prove." "You don't fix what's not broken on the inside," Ethan said. The younger man's expression faltered just long enough for Ethan to notice. He lit a cigarette, exhaled hard, and turned back to his truck. "Good luck with your pet," he said. "Maybe you'll teach it to dance next." When the truck disappeared, Ethan stood still for a long time. Then he looked at Ashen, who was staring toward the road, tail flicking in the wind. "He doesn't get it," Ethan whispered. "He thinks this is about pride." He walked back inside, grabbed a handful of oats, and fed them to the horse from his palm. The touch of the animal's breath against his skin was warm, grounding. That night, a different kind of sound filled the barn, the faint patter of rain. After months of nothing but wind and dust, water began to fall from the sky, hitting the tin roof in soft rhythm. Ethan stood under the doorway, letting the cool mist touch his face. Ashen stepped forward, head raised, eyes half closed as if remembering something ancient. The smell of wet earth and hay filled the air. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something wash through him. Not joy exactly, but release. He watched as the horse turned toward him, dripping with rain, ears alert. "You hear that?" he said, smiling faintly. "That's the sound of second chances." The next morning, the world looked different. The dust had settled, the ground darkened with moisture. Ethan found Maggie's note slipped under a stone by the door. "Coffee's on at the diner, if you ever need a place to sit." He folded it carefully and placed it on the shelf beside his tools. Ashen's leg had healed enough for short trots. Ethan led him outside, the rope slack, the rhythm easy. The horse took uneven but determined steps across the wet sand. Each hoofprint filled slowly with water, a mirror reflecting the pale blue sky. "Not so broken," Ethan murmured again. "Just needed time." In the distance, thunder rolled again, but softer this time, like a promise rather than a threat. Inside the barn, the cornbread wrapper rustled in the wind. Ethan smiled, set his hat low, and began walking beside the horse toward the horizon. Neither of them noticed the black truck parked far off on the ridge, its engine silent, its driver watching. Charles Davenport stood by the door, cigarette unlit, eyes following the man and the horse moving together through the washed-out landscape. He didn't smile this time. He just stood there, as if something in the dust and rain had begun to undo him. The days bled into one another like soft brush strokes of the same color, each carrying the faint hum of routine. Dawn found Ethan already awake, standing by the barn door as the first light broke over the Texas hills. The world still smelled faintly of rain, that rare perfume of clean earth and rust. Ashen stood in his stall, ears twitching toward the morning sounds, the chirp of sparrows, the creak of wood expanding in the heat. Ethan poured water into a tin bucket, humming under his breath. His voice was low, roughened by years of silence, but Ashen tilted his head toward it, as if the sound itself carried comfort. "You remember the forge?" Ethan murmured, half to himself. "How the air would taste of fire. You learn not to fear the heat once you know what it makes." He reached out, touching the horse's neck. Ashen no longer flinched. The once tight muscles under his palm loosened with every breath. The man smiled faintly. "That's it, boy. You're learning to trust again." After breakfast, coffee for Ethan, hay and oats for Ashen, they began their walk to the dry creek bed. Each step of the horse was slow but steady, the limp less noticeable now. Dust rose around their feet, glowing in the morning light like smoke. Ethan guided him through a small circle, then another, the way he used to train young horses years ago. "Step and breathe," he said softly. "That's all you need. Step and breathe." As they moved, a pickup truck rattled by on the distant road. The driver honked and waved mockingly. Ethan didn't even turn. He kept his hand on the rope, his focus on the rhythm of hooves. The world could laugh if it wanted. This moment belonged only to them. Later that day, Maggie appeared again, this time with a paper sack. "Brought you something," she said, setting it on the fence. "Apple pie. Don't argue." Ethan smiled, brushing sweat from his brow. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said simply, glancing at the horse. "He looks stronger. He's starting to believe," Ethan replied. "That's half the battle." She lingered, leaning against the fence. "Charles Davenport came by the diner this morning. He's been asking about you." Ethan frowned. "About me?" Maggie nodded. "Didn't say much, just questions. What you were doing out here, how the horse was holding up." He sighed, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. "Men like him don't ask questions unless they plan to take something back." Maggie studied him a moment, then said quietly, "Maybe he's starting to see something he didn't before." Ethan didn't answer. He took the sack from her hands and nodded his thanks. After she left, he stood there for a long while, the sky melting into shades of copper. Behind him, Ashen blew softly through his nose, the sound almost like reassurance. That night, a warm wind swept through the barn. Ethan sat near the stall, whittling a small piece of wood with a pocket knife, a habit from the old days when his son would beg him to carve toys. The shavings fell around his boots like curled feathers. He shaped a tiny horse, crude but honest, and set it on the beam beside him. "Not much to look at," he muttered, "but it'll stand." Ashen snorted quietly, and Ethan chuckled. "You'd laugh too, huh? Guess I deserve that?" The wind pressed against the walls, a soft howl across the plains. Ethan reached up and dimmed the lantern, letting the shadows settle around them. The horse shifted once, then came closer, resting his head over the stall door. For a long moment, neither moved. They simply breathed together, the slow, heavy rhythm of two lives mending. Outside, thunder rumbled far away. The air thickened with humidity, that uneasy silence before a storm. Ethan ran a hand down the horse's muzzle, feeling the warmth beneath the skin. "Easy," he whispered. "It's just weather. We've both seen worse." The first flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a roll of thunder that shook the rafters. Ashen startled, muscles quivering. Ethan stood quickly, stepping inside the stall. "I'm here," he said, pressing his chest against the horse's shoulder. "Easy, boy. Breathe with me." The animal's heart thudded like a drum, echoing in Ethan's ribs. He whispered words he didn't remember forming, old phrases his father once used to calm frightened colts. "Steady, steady, trust the dark. It passes." Rain began to fall, thin, uncertain drops at first, then a steady downpour. The roof hissed as if sighing in relief. Ethan stayed beside Ashen until the trembling eased. When the thunder rolled again, the horse no longer jumped. His breathing matched Ethan's, deep and slow. Hours passed before the storm broke apart. Water pooled at the edges of the barn, glinting in the lantern light. Ethan leaned his forehead against Ashen's neck, exhausted. "You did good," he murmured. "You didn't run." The horse exhaled through his nostrils, the sound warm against Ethan's skin. Outside, the storm faded into a whisper of rain. By dawn, the world smelled new again. The air was cool, almost kind. Ethan opened the barn doors to let the light in. Mist rose from the ground in soft ribbons, curling around Ashen's legs. The horse stepped forward cautiously, testing the damp soil, then took another step. Sure, unhurried, free. Ethan stood beside him, hands in his pockets, watching. For the first time, he didn't see the limp. He saw motion. Life, where there used to be defeat. Later that day, while hammering new nails into the corral fence, Ethan caught a glimpse of movement at the ridge. A truck, black and still, just like before. Charles again, no doubt. The man didn't come closer this time. He only watched. Then, as if satisfied by what he'd seen, or shaken by it, he turned and drove away. Ethan leaned on the hammer, heart steady. He looked at Ashen grazing near the fence and whispered, "Let him watch. Maybe one day he'll understand what real work looks like." That night, Ethan placed the carved wooden horse on the shelf beside Maggie's folded note. He lit the lantern low and sat quietly. The barn breathed with him, every creak a reminder that even broken things can hold. He reached out, resting his hand on the warm flank beside him. "You and me," he said softly. "We're done surviving. It's time we start living again." Ashen shifted closer, brushing his nose against Ethan's shoulder. The man smiled, closing his eyes. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet soil and the promise of a clear tomorrow, a rare, fragile peace that both man and animal had almost forgotten how to feel. The heat came back with a vengeance. It baked the dirt until it cracked, silenced the birds, and turned the horizon into a mirage that shimmered like fire. Ethan wiped his forehead with the back of his arm as he hammered the last plank into place on the corral fence. Sweat and sawdust streaked his face, but he didn't mind. Labor gave shape to his days again, each nail a small defiance against the emptiness that used to own him. Ashen stood nearby, tail flicking lazily, his coat almost silver in the noon light. The horse had filled out, ribs no longer sharp, his gait steadier. There was still a tremor in his step, but it didn't own him anymore. Ethan smiled as he watched the horse lower his head to graze. "That's it," he murmured. "One step at a time." The faint hum of engines grew louder from the road beyond the ridge. It wasn't unusual. Trucks often passed on their way to the oil fields, but this one slowed, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Ethan looked up, eyes narrowing. A sleek black pickup rolled into view, gleaming under the sun like a shark in shallow water. Charles Davenport stepped out, his shirt pressed, his hair perfect even in the wind. He carried a bottle of mineral water, and the kind of confidence that made other men uncomfortable. "You've been busy," he said, scanning the fence, the repaired roof, the clean yard. "Didn't think a man like you knew how to rebuild." Ethan didn't look at him. He picked up the hammer, slid it into his belt. "You think work belongs to people with money?" Charles smiled, but it was thin, defensive. "Money builds faster. You could have asked for help. I'd have sent someone." "Yeah," Ethan said, "and you'd have had another laugh at my expense." Charles hesitated, then took a sip from the bottle. "It was a joke, Cole. You're taking this whole thing too seriously." Ethan turned, his eyes sharp. "You humiliated a man who already had nothing left. Tell me what's funny about that." The words landed like a hammer blow. For a moment, Charles said nothing. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dry hay and rust. Somewhere, a hawk screamed high above the valley. He shoved his hands into his pockets. "You could have sold the horse," he said quietly. "Could have walked away. But you didn't." "Why?" "Because walking away is how I lost everything else," Ethan replied. "I was done leaving things to die." Charles stared at him, something uneasy flickering behind his calm. He looked toward Ashen, who stood watching them both with that steady, unblinking gaze. The animal's presence unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. "You talk like that horse is going to save you," he said finally. Ethan shrugged. "Maybe he already did." Charles left without another word, his boots crunching over the dry earth. The sound of the truck engine faded into the distance, leaving behind only silence and the echo of something heavier than pride. That night, Ethan sat outside the barn, a lantern beside him, the desert air thick with dust. He thought about the man in the black truck, about how arrogance sometimes hid a wound that still bled. He'd seen it before. In soldiers. In himself. People wore cruelty like armor when they couldn't stand their own reflection. Ashen wandered closer, muzzle brushing Ethan's shoulder. The touch pulled him back to the present. He reached up and stroked the horse's neck. "Don't worry," he said. "He'll figure it out, or he won't. Either way, we'll keep walking." The next morning, Ethan took Ashen down the dirt road to a small clearing near the creek bed. It was the same path they had trained on before, but today he loosened the rope completely. "Go on," he said, stepping back. "Let's see what you remember." Ashen hesitated, then started forward. The limp was still there, but faint, like a scar that no longer hurt. His hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as he picked up a slow trot. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, a quiet pride he hadn't felt since the days when his son rode beside him, laughing in the sun. When Ashen circled back, Ethan raised his hand, and the horse stopped a few feet away. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and the air between them felt electric. "Good boy," he whispered. That evening, Maggie arrived again, carrying a box of canned goods and a folded newspaper. "Brought supplies," she said. "And you might want to see this." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and took the paper. The headline read, local tycoon to sponsor charity horse parade, a celebration of heritage, says Davenport. Under the photo, Charles smiled with practiced charm, one hand resting on a horse far healthier than Ashen had ever been. Ethan snorted. Figures. He needs to remind folks what a hero he is. Maggie studied him carefully. Maybe you should go. Go? To the parade. Show them what you've done here. Let people see what real work looks like. Ethan shook his head. They'll just laugh again. Maybe, or maybe they won't. People like a comeback story, Ethan. He folded the paper, set it aside. I didn't do this for a story. Maggie gave a small smile. I know, but sometimes the right story changes people who need it most. When she left, the barn felt too quiet. The newspaper sat on the workbench, the photo of Charles staring up with that empty smile. Ethan sighed and walked to Ashen's stall. The horse lifted his head, eyes steady. A parade, huh? Ethan said softly. You think we belong there? Ashen's tail flicked once, and Ethan chuckled. Didn't think so. The next day, while patching a leak in the roof, Ethan heard laughter drifting from the road. He looked down to see two teenage boys pointing at the barn. That's him, one shouted. The guy with the crippled horse. They laughed and rode off on their bikes, the sound trailing behind them. Ethan froze, hammer in hand. For a second, the old humiliation burned through him again. Then he took a breath, steadied himself, and got back to work. The sound of the hammer striking nail echoed through the quiet valley, sharp and rhythmic, drowning out the laughter. When the sun dipped low, he led Ashen outside once more. The sky turned to molten orange, the world glowing in firelight. They can call us what they want, he said. We'll just keep showing up. The horse turned his head, one good eye catching the light, glinting like a piece of old silver. That night, as the wind carried dust through the half-open door, Ethan sat alone by the lantern, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Somewhere out there, Charles Davenport was planning a parade, a spectacle of power and money. But here, in the quiet heart of the desert, a man and a horse had already reclaimed something far more valuable. Ethan reached for the small, carved horse on the shelf and ran a finger along its rough edges. Let them laugh, he murmured. They'll see soon enough. Ashen shifted in his stall, blowing softly, as if agreeing. Outside, the night deepened into silence, and the wind carried no laughter this time, only the faint whisper of shame drifting through the dark, belonging to someone far away in a house full of lights who couldn't sleep. The desert that morning wore a strange silence, the kind that comes before the world remembers what chaos sounds like. The sky hung heavy and colorless, and the air smelled of metal and electricity. Ethan could feel it before he saw it, the storm waiting just beyond the horizon. He tightened the latch on the barn door, glanced at the clouds that were gathering like bruises in the distance, and said softly to Ashen, We're in for it, old boy. The horse lifted his head, ears twitching at the deep hum that rolled through the valley. Even in calm weather, Ashen had always been uneasy when thunder threatened. Ethan brushed a hand down his neck. You've lived through worse. So have I. He moved through the barn, securing loose tools and covering feed sacks. Dust whirled around his boots. By noon, the light had turned sickly yellow. The wind had a weight to it now, carrying distant howls that could have been coyotes or the ghosts of old storms returning for another round. Maggie stopped by on her way back from town. Her old truck rumbled to a stop at the gate, windshield wipers struggling against the first scattered drops. "You should come down to the diner," she called out. "This storm's going to rip the roof off that place." Ethan shook his head. "We'll be fine." "You sure?" He looked back at Ashen, who was pacing in the stall, muscles twitching beneath the gray coat. "He doesn't like to be left alone," Ethan said. "And truth be told, neither do I." Maggie hesitated, then nodded. "All right, you're both as stubborn as the land itself." She tossed a small bag from the truck window. "Extra lantern oil and a bit of jerky, just in case the power goes." "Appreciate it." She started the engine again. "If you change your mind, the lights will be on." By the time her taillights vanished, the wind had risen to a full-throated growl. Dust stung Ethan's eyes as he closed the main door and secured the crossbar. The world dimmed to a twilight that shouldn't have belonged to mid-afternoon. Inside, the lantern burned low and steady, casting long, trembling shadows across the stall walls. The first thunderclap came like a cannon, shaking dust from the rafters. Ashen jerked violently, hooves clattering against the floorboards. Ethan moved quickly, catching the rope before the horse could rear. "Easy, easy," he said, voice calm but firm. "It's just noise." Another flash split the sky, white fire through the gaps in the roof. Ashen's breathing grew fast and ragged. Ethan pressed his body close to the horse's shoulder, whispering, "I'm right here. Just breathe with me." Rain began to hammer the roof in sheets. The wind screamed through every crack and seam. The old barn groaned as if it might collapse. Ethan's heart pounded in his throat, but his voice stayed steady, the same tone he had once used to soothe his son when nightmares came. "You're safe. You hear me? You're safe." Minutes passed, maybe hours. The line between them blurred. Thunder crashed, the ground shook, and the world outside disappeared into gray. Ashen trembled, then pressed his forehead against Ethan's shoulder. The warmth of the animal's breath seeped through his shirt, grounding him. And then, slowly, the storm's rhythm began to change. The thunder rolled farther away. The rain softened to a whisper. Ethan loosened his grip on the rope and exhaled. "We made it," he murmured. "You did good, Ashen. You didn't run." The horse shifted, sides heaving, the air thick with the smell of rain and sweat. Ethan leaned against the stall post, every muscle aching. "That's twice now you've stayed when the world wanted you gone," he said, almost smiling. When the door finally creaked open, night had fallen. The sky outside shimmered with lightning in the far distance. Water pooled around the barn, reflecting the trembling lantern light. Ethan stepped outside barefoot, the mud cool against his skin. The land looked strange under the storm's afterglow. Cleansed, alive, reborn. He looked up and saw something he hadn't seen in years. Stars, faint behind the parting clouds. For the first time, the dark didn't scare him. It felt like a blanket drawn across a fevered brow. He went back inside, where Ashen stood calmer now, his mane damp and tangled. Ethan filled a bucket with fresh water and set it down. The horse drank slowly, steam curling from his breath. "You know," Ethan said, "you remind me of someone I used to be." He pulled up an old crate, sat down, and reached for the small wooden carving on the shelf. The tiny horse he'd whittled days ago caught the lantern light, its rough edges casting soft shadows. "When I was young," he said, voice barely above a whisper, I thought strength was noise, shouting, working till your hands bled, fighting every damn thing that tried to push you down. He paused, watching Ashen's ear flick toward him. But it's not. It's this. Staying. Breathing when you want to run. The horse flicked his tail and settled. Ethan chuckled. Guess you already knew that. Outside, frogs croaked from puddles that hadn't existed that morning. The land, starved for water, was singing again. The air smelled of grass and life. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes, listening. Hours later, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Charles Davenport standing there, drenched to the bone, hair plastered to his forehead. Behind him, his truck was half buried in mud. "Looks like you found the one place in Texas that didn't blow away," Charles said, voice unsteady. Ethan didn't speak. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the lantern's light. Charles hesitated, then entered. He looked around at the walls, the patched roof, the horse standing calm in the corner. His gaze softened for a moment. "You fixed this place," he said quietly. Ethan nodded. "With what I had." Charles's eyes lingered on Ashen. "He's different. Stronger. Same as the rest of us when we stop listening to other people's laughter," Ethan said. For a long time, neither man spoke. Rain dripped from Charles's sleeves onto the dirt floor. The horse snorted softly, the only sound in the room. Finally, Charles sighed. "You ever get tired of being right?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Only when it matters." The younger man laughed once, a real laugh this time, short, quiet, uncertain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a silver flask. "For the cold," he said, handing it over. Ethan hesitated, then took a sip. The burn was sharp, almost welcome. When Charles left, the mud sucked at his boots, the storm finally giving way to dawn. Ethan watched him go, the truck's headlights carving a fragile path through the wet haze. Inside, Ashen rested his head over the stall door, eyes half closed, breathing slow and even. Ethan brushed a hand down his muzzle. "See?" he said softly. "Even the rich ones get lost in the rain." The first light of morning seeped through the broken boards, pale and forgiving. The storm had stripped the land bare, but it had also washed it clean. Ethan leaned against the stall, feeling the quiet pulse of life beside him. "Every storm ends," he whispered, "but some of them leave something behind worth keeping." Ashen's breath warmed the air between them. The barn creaked once, settling, as if agreeing. And somewhere far off, beyond the soaked fields and fading thunder, the desert began to bloom again. The week after the storm felt like waking into a new world. The desert, washed clean, wore a thin green film of grass that hadn't been seen in years. The air carried a sweetness that didn't belong to Texas, something almost forgiving. Ethan stood at the edge of the corral one morning, watching Ashen lift his head to the sunrise. The horse's coat shimmered with life again, silver beneath the gold. Maggie's old truck rolled up the dirt path, leaving tracks through the damp earth. She climbed out with a folded paper in her hand. "You seen this?" she asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cool air. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, took the paper, and unfolded it. On the front page, bold letters read, "The San Marlo Heritage Parade returns, sponsored by Davenport Oil." Beneath it, a photograph of Charles stood beside a gleaming thoroughbred, smiling like a man rehearsing for applause. "They're doing it this weekend," Maggie said. "Same town square, same crowd. You should go." Ethan shook his head slowly. "You know what they think of me." "Maybe," she said, "but maybe it's time they saw something real." He looked past her to Ashen, who was pawing the ground impatiently. "You think they'd even let us in?" Maggie's lips curved into a sly smile. "I might know someone on the committee. Besides, they can't stop a man from showing up." That evening, Ethan sat by the barn door, the newspaper folded neatly beside him. The lantern light cast long shadows over Ashen's stall. He thought about the laughter from the auction, about the night he'd led the horse away through the dark, humiliated but unbroken. So much of his life had been spent hiding from noise, crowds, voices, even his own thoughts. But maybe silence could speak louder than any of them if he brought it to the right place. "Guess it's our turn to make a little noise," he said quietly. Ashen's ears flicked at the sound of his voice. The morning of the parade arrived cold and bright. The streets of San Marlo buzzed with people setting up banners and folding chairs. Vendors fried dough, country songs spilled from radios, and children waved paper flags. In the middle of it all stood Charles Davenport, every inch the image of success. Polished boots, white hat, and a new horse so perfect it looked sculpted from light. Ethan guided Ashen through the crowd, feeling eyes turn toward him as he passed. Whispers followed. "Is that the old drifter? The one with the broken horse?" He kept his head high. The sound of hooves on pavement was steady, patient. At the entrance to the main square, a marshal stopped him. "Sir, this is for registered riders only." Maggie stepped forward from the crowd. "He's with me," she said. "Local entry." The marshal hesitated, then shrugged. "Keep to the back. Don't get in anyone's way." "Wouldn't dream of it," Ethan replied, voice calm. When the parade began, it was a blur of color and applause. Children waved, brass bands played, and horses gleamed under ribbons. Charles rode near the front, smiling for cameras. But when Ethan and Ashen entered the square, the noise shifted. Applause faded into murmurs. People recognized him. Some smirked. Others just stared. Ashen moved with quiet grace, his limp barely visible. The horse's coat caught the sunlight, and the air seemed to pause. Even the band faltered for a moment. Ethan didn't wave. He didn't bow. He simply rode, his hands light on the reins, his expression calm as wind through wheat. From his place near the podium, Charles saw them. For an instant, his practiced smile wavered. He had seen many horses in his life, but none like this one. The one he had thrown away now moving with dignity through the crowd. As they passed the reviewing stand, Ethan caught Charles's eye. There was no triumph there, only understanding. He gave a small nod, and Charles looked down, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. The silence deepened. The laughter that had once followed Ethan was gone, replaced by something else. Respect, or maybe shame, shared by everyone watching. It was the kind of silence that stripped pride bare. When the parade ended, people began to drift toward Ethan. A child came first, a boy no older than 10, holding a paper flag. "Mister," the boy said shyly, "that horse is beautiful." Ethan smiled, his voice soft. "He's got a good heart. That's what makes him shine." He dismounted slowly, patting Ashen's neck. The horse stood calm despite the noise returning around them. Maggie appeared, eyes glinting. "You did it," she said. "You showed them." "I didn't have to," Ethan replied. "He did." Charles approached then, hat in hand. His voice was low. "You proved your point." Ethan turned to face him. "Wasn't trying to." "Then why come?" "To remind you," Ethan said, "that what you throw away still has breath in it." Charles's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to the crowd that was still watching. "You made me look like a fool," he said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "No, you did that yourself. I just stopped pretending not to hear it." The words hung between them, heavy but true. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Charles exhaled and said, almost to himself, "I didn't think you'd keep the horse." "Most people don't think beyond the sale," Ethan answered. "But he's not just a horse anymore. He's proof that kindness works harder than pride ever will." Charles looked down at the dust on his boots. When he looked up again, there was no anger left, only something quieter, almost human. He nodded once, turned, and walked away. Ethan stayed until the sun began to set, talking softly to the children who came to pet Ashen's mane. The light turned amber, stretching the shadows of man and horse across the square. Someone began to clap, slow, unsure, and others joined. Within moments, the sound spread until it filled the space completely. But Ethan didn't bow. He didn't raise his hand. He just smiled faintly and whispered to Ashen, "We don't need applause, do we?" The horse flicked his tail and nickered softly in reply. By the time the crowd thinned and the vendors packed up their stalls, the square had returned to quiet. Maggie helped him lead Ashen to the edge of town, her eyes shining. "You realize what you did back there?" she asked. Ethan looked at the fading light, the empty street. "I didn't do anything. They just saw him for what he is." "Then maybe they saw you too," she said. He chuckled, low and weary. "Maybe, but seeing and understanding are two different things." They reached the old road that led back to the barn. Behind them, the last notes of the band drifted on the evening wind. Ahead, the desert stretched open and wide. Ashen walked beside him, head high, the rhythm of his steps calm and sure. At the top of the ridge, Ethan stopped and looked back one last time. The town shimmered in the distance under the setting sun. Somewhere, he imagined, Charles was sitting in a quiet office, the sound of applause still echoing in his mind. Not for him, but for what he'd given away. Ethan touched Ashen's neck and whispered, "You showed them what silence sounds like." The horse breathed out, a slow, steady sigh. Together, they turned toward the horizon, the last of the light spilling across their path, like forgiveness. The night after the parade was unnaturally still, as if the wind itself had stopped to listen. The town had gone quiet. Even the neon signs outside the diner flickered out early. Ethan sat outside the barn, the desert stretching endlessly under a silver moon. Ashen slept standing, his breath deep and steady. The day had worn both of them down, but Ethan couldn't sleep. Something inside him, something heavy and unfinished, kept turning like an old gear that refused to rust to silence. He replayed every moment from the parade, the stares, the whispers, the hush that had fallen when they stepped into the square. He hadn't gone there for approval, but still, he'd felt the weight of it. The silence of hundreds of people seeing him, really seeing him, after years of invisibility. But what stayed in his chest wasn't pride. It was something smaller, humbler. A quiet kind of gratitude. The sound of tires on gravel broke the stillness. Ethan turned, squinting toward the road. A single set of headlights approached, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The truck slowed near the gate. A moment later, Charles Davenport stepped out. No tailored jacket this time, no white hat. Just a man in a wrinkled shirt, sleeves rolled up, his posture uncertain. He stood there for a moment before speaking. "Can I come in?" Ethan didn't move right away. He studied the man, the way he shifted from one foot to the other, the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. Finally, he nodded. "Doors open." Charles walked toward the barn, boots sinking into soft dirt. Inside, the lantern cast a pale halo over Ashen's stall. The horse raised his head and snorted quietly, as if he recognized the visitor. Charles hesitated near the door. "He looks different," he said softly. "He is," Ethan replied. "So am I." For a long while, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the rustle of straw and the whisper of wind finding its way through the cracks. Finally, Charles said, "You embarrassed me today." Ethan looked up, calm. "Didn't mean to." "I know." Charles leaned against the post, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's what makes it worse." Ethan waited. He knew the kind of pride Charles carried. It didn't break easily, only bent under the right kind of silence. After a pause, Charles sighed. "When I bought that horse, I was drunk on laughter. It wasn't even about you. It was about power. Being seen. I thought giving away something broken made me look generous. Never occurred to me that the only broken thing that day was me." Ethan didn't answer right away. He reached out, resting a hand on Ashen's neck. "Sometimes it takes a fool to wake another fool," he said. Charles let out a shaky laugh, almost bitter. "Guess we're both fools. Then?" "Difference is," Ethan said, "some of us stay fools. Some of us learn." The younger man nodded, his eyes glistening in the lamplight. He reached into the bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a bundle wrapped in canvas. "I brought something." He unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a saddle. Old, cracked, but beautifully made. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She loved horses. Said they never lie to you. I thought maybe he should have it. Seemed right." Ethan touched the worn leather, running his thumb along the faint engraving near the stirrup. "To trust is to heal." The words shimmered in the lamplight, carved deep and deliberate. "She was a wise woman," Ethan said. "She was," Charles whispered. "And I'm not sure I deserve to carry her name anymore." Ethan looked at him steadily. "Deserve's got nothing to do with it. You fix what you can, and you carry what you can't." Charles nodded, swallowing hard. He stepped closer to Ashen, hesitating. The horse tensed at first, then relaxed when Ethan gave a small nod. Slowly, Charles reached out and touched the horse's cheek. "He should have hated me," he said. "But he doesn't." "Hate burns fast," Ethan replied. "Trust lasts longer." For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, one hand on the horse, one hand holding the memory of guilt. Outside, the desert wind rose again, brushing softly against the barn like a whisper of forgiveness. Charles stepped back, his voice rough. "I can't undo what I did." "No one's asking you to," Ethan said. "You just start walking the other way." He nodded slowly. "I don't know where that road is." "Then start here," Ethan said. "It's as good a place as any." Charles looked around the barn. The patched roof, the small shelf of tools, the carved wooden horse sitting on the beam. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "This place feels alive," he said, "like it belongs to the world again." "It does," Ethan said. "We both do." Before leaving, Charles turned back. "You know," he said, "people at the parade, some of them said you made them cry." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then maybe we did something right." Charles nodded, his expression somewhere between sorrow and gratitude. He extended a hand. Ethan hesitated, then shook it. Their grip was firm, neither dominant nor submissive, just honest. When the truck's headlights finally disappeared into the dark, Ethan stayed by the door, listening to the sound fade until it was gone. The night felt lighter somehow, as if the earth had exhaled. Inside, Ashen shifted, the new saddle gleaming softly under the lantern light. Ethan ran his hand along its edge. "Guess it fits you better than it ever fit him," he said. The horse gave a quiet snort as if agreeing. Ethan sat down on the crate beside the stall, the saddle resting nearby. His mind wandered, not to Charles, not even to the parade, but to his son's laughter, the one that used to fill the forge when life still had order. The memory no longer hurt the way it used to. It was softer now, worn smooth by time, like river stones. He whispered, "If you could see us now, kiddo, you'd laugh at your old man talking to a horse." Ashen flicked his ears, and Ethan chuckled quietly. "Yeah," he said, "you'd probably like him too." The moon rose higher, flooding the desert with silver. Crickets began their chorus, and somewhere far away, a coyote called. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes, listening. The barn smelled of wood, leather, and rain-damp earth, like everything that mattered had found its way home. He wasn't sure when he drifted to sleep, but in his dream, he was back at the forge. The fire burned bright, his son's laughter ringing behind him, and outside the window stood a gray horse, whole and proud, waiting. When dawn came, he woke to the real thing. Ashen was standing in the doorway, the morning light spilling over him, the saddle gleaming on his back. The desert wind was soft again, and for once, Ethan felt like he'd already crossed every storm worth fighting. He rose slowly, stretched, and whispered, "We're still standing, partner. That's what counts." Ashen nudged his shoulder, and Ethan smiled. The horse's breath against his skin was warm, alive, forgiving. The night of regret had passed, and in its place, something new had taken root, quiet, strong, and steady as dawn itself. Morning came soft and golden, carrying the scent of new grass and the faint hum of cicadas waking in the brush. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole's mornings began not with the ache of survival, but with purpose. He stood outside the barn, if you could still call it that now, and looked at the transformation rising from its bones. The roof no longer sagged. The walls had been reinforced with new boards he'd salvaged from a demolished gas station. The sign above the entrance, carved carefully by hand, read in uneven letters, "Ashen Stables." It wasn't fancy, but it was honest, and that mattered more than perfection ever would. Ethan leaned on the fence, watching the horse graze in the pasture. Ashen's coat gleamed silver under the sun, the old limp now barely a whisper in his step. Sometimes people from town would stop by the dirt road, lean out of their trucks and stare. They didn't laugh anymore. Some would nod, some would wave, and a few, those who remembered the man who once slept under the bridge, would leave small offerings at the gate. A bag of oats, a note, a loaf of bread. Maggie came by every other day, bringing coffee, and that easy patience of hers. "You've made a miracle out here," she said one morning, setting 2 mugs on the fence post. Ethan smiled. "Wasn't me. Just gave things time to breathe again." She sipped her coffee, squinting at the horizon. Funny how that's all most things ever need. The days found rhythm again. Ethan repaired fences for neighbors, fixed broken gates, shod the odd horse that needed care. In return, people brought supplies: planks, nails, ropes. Little by little, the place became something more than a shelter. It became a refuge. One afternoon, as he was painting the new signpost, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned to see a small red pickup roll up to the gate. A boy of about 10 climbed out, clutching a notebook and a sketch pad. "Mr. Cole?" the boy asked, shy but determined. "That's me." "I'm Wyatt. My mom said you might let me draw your horse." Ethan glanced toward the pasture where Ashen stood in the shade of the old oak. "He doesn't pose for free," he said, feigning seriousness. The boy grinned. "I brought apples." Ethan chuckled. "Then you've got a deal." Wyatt spent the afternoon sitting cross-legged near the fence, sketching while Ethan mended a saddle. Occasionally, he'd look up and ask questions. Was he always this calm? How come his leg's funny? Ethan answered simply, never hiding the truth. He's calm because he learned to trust what wouldn't hurt him. And his leg? That's just a reminder he made it through. When the boy finished, he showed Ethan the drawing. A simple pencil sketch of Ashen standing tall, the word home written beneath. Ethan stared at it longer than he meant to. The boy blushed under the weight of his silence. "You can keep it," he said quickly. Ethan nodded, his voice caught. "I'll hang it right here." He pinned the drawing beside the stall door, under the small carving of the wooden horse that had followed him through every storm. As summer deepened, Ashen Stables began to draw visitors, farmers, travelers, and the occasional child who wanted to see the horse that came back. They brought stories and laughter, filling the once empty space with life. Ethan never charged anyone a dime. "Not everything that heals has to make money," he'd say, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. One evening, near sunset, a familiar black truck appeared at the gate. Ethan froze, half expecting the old pain to return. But when Charles stepped out, there was no arrogance left in him. He looked different, tired in a way that meant real work had finally touched him. "Nice place," Charles said, eyes tracing the fences, the painted sign, the slow movement of the horse in the yard. "Still needs fixing," Ethan replied. "Like everything else." Charles reached into the truck bed and lifted a crate. "Feed. Thought I'd drop it off. Didn't want to show up empty-handed." Ethan helped him carry it to the barn. When they were done, they stood in the open doorway, looking out at the field. The air smelled of hay and dust, and the light fell soft over everything. Charles broke the silence first. "You were right, you know. About me. I built a whole life out of people laughing for the wrong reasons." Ethan nodded, but said nothing. "I sold the oil business last month," Charles continued. "Didn't make sense anymore. I started something smaller, restoration work, old barns mostly, places like this." He gave a small, sheepish smile. "Guess you rubbed off on me." Ethan's eyes softened. Could be worse things to catch. They both laughed quietly, the sound mingling with the evening wind. Before Charles left, he walked over to Ashen and placed a hand on the horse's mane. "Take care of him," he said. "I intend to," Ethan replied. Charles looked back once, then drove away, dust curling in his wake like smoke from an old fire finally dying out. When the night settled, Ethan hung a new lantern above the barn door. The flame flickered, casting long, warm light over the sign that bore the name they'd both earned. Ashen Stables. The desert wind carried the faint scent of rain again, but this time it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like memory. Inside, Ashen lay resting on a bed of fresh straw, the saddle still shining faintly in the corner. Ethan sat beside him, sipping coffee gone cold, and whispered, "You did good, old boy. You gave more than I ever could." He took Wyatt's drawing from the wall, traced the word home with his thumb, then placed it on the wooden beam where everyone could see. "That's what this is now," he said softly. "Not just for us." The night deepened. Crickets sang their low hymn, and the stars seemed closer than usual. Ethan leaned back, listening to the rhythm of the horse's breathing, the steady, quiet sound of a life rebuilt from ruins. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend, visitors to greet, and a sunrise to meet head-on. But for now, everything was exactly as it should be. Simple, fragile, and real. He whispered into the dark, "It's enough." Ashen stirred in his sleep, as if in agreement. And outside, the lantern above the barn glowed against the night like a promise kept. The heat returned with the slow patience of something ancient. By late August, the green that had blanketed the land after the rain began to fade again, curling back into gold and ochre. But this time, it wasn't desolation. It was rhythm. Life in Texas always learned to bend before it broke. Ethan stood at the edge of the dry riverbed behind Ashen Stables, his boots half buried in the cracked soil. Morning light poured down the canyon walls, soft and amber. Ashen grazed nearby, his shadow stretching long over the ground. It had been months since the parade, and the whispers that once clung to Ethan's name had turned into something gentler. Folks still came by from town, some to help, some to learn, most just to sit a while and remember that quiet could heal too. He leaned on the old fence post, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching the wind move through the grass like a slow tide. Behind him, the stable's roof gleamed, newly painted by volunteers. The words Ashen Stables, where broken things learn to run again, had been burned into the signboard by a local carpenter who refused to take payment. Ethan had insisted on adding one more word beneath it: home. He turned as a small pickup came up the road, dust rising behind it. Wyatt jumped out, his notebook clutched in hand. "Mr. Cole," he called, his voice bright. "Mama says the school wants to use your story in the fall fair. They're calling it The Man Who Rebuilt Hope." Ethan laughed softly. "Sounds too fancy for me, kid." "Can we take pictures of Ashen for it?" Wyatt asked eagerly. "Sure thing," Ethan said, patting the boy's shoulder. "Just don't make him look prettier than me." Wyatt grinned. "Can't promise that." As the boy set up his little camera, Ethan watched him with a quiet fondness. The world had a way of finding its way back through small hands and bright eyes. When Wyatt was done, he ran back to the truck and waved goodbye, his laughter echoing down the dirt road. When the sound faded, Ethan turned back toward the horizon. The sun was high now, the air trembling in the heat. Somewhere beyond the hills, he knew Charles Davenport was working a different kind of life, mending barns, restoring land, and building things that didn't shine but lasted. Every few weeks a letter arrived from him, never long, always handwritten. The last one had simply said, "You were right. Kindness does build slower, but it doesn't fall apart." Ethan kept that letter folded in his jacket pocket. He'd read it sometimes at night, by the lantern, when the wind howled and the roof creaked, and it reminded him that even the proud can learn to bow to something greater. That evening, as the sun began to sink, Maggie stopped by. Her hair had gone more silver since spring, but her smile hadn't changed. She leaned against the truck door, watching Ashen drink from the trough. "He's walking smoother," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "We both are." She handed him a jar of honey from the diner. "On the house," she said. "For sweet days ahead." He took it carefully. "You're gonna spoil us." "You've earned a little spoiling." They stood in silence, the kind that says more than words ever could. The crickets were already tuning their song, and the wind had cooled just enough to carry the smell of hay and sage. Maggie looked around the yard, the lights strung along the stable roof, the laughter of a few local kids who'd come by to help feed Ashen, the easy stillness of it all. "It's funny," she said. "The first time I saw this place, it looked dead. Now it feels like it could outlive us all." Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe that's the point. When night finally fell, the sky turned the color of dark velvet, scattered with stars so bright they looked almost close enough to touch. Ethan sat by the stable door, Ashen beside him, the old saddle gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He traced his fingers over the engraved words. "To trust is to heal." "You did that, old boy," he said softly. "You healed us both." Ashen's ear flicked toward him, and the horse let out a slow, contented breath. Ethan leaned back against the post, his body heavy but peaceful. In the distance, thunder murmured, a small storm moving far across the plains. He smiled at the sound. "Go ahead," he whispered. "We're not afraid of you anymore." Later, when the wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of rain and dust, Ethan rose. He walked with Ashen down to the edge of the dry riverbed, where faint trickles of water shimmered under the moonlight, the first hints of a coming flood that would fill the valley again. Ashen stopped, dipping his head to sniff the air, then looked up at him with that familiar calm. Ethan rested a hand on the horse's neck. "We made it," he said. "Didn't we?" Ashen pressed his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder, a gentle nod in the language only trust could speak. They stood there for a long time, framed by the silver of the moon and the faint sound of water returning to the earth. When Ethan finally turned back toward the barn, he paused and looked once more at the sign glowing softly in the lantern's light. Ashen Stables. Home. The wind moved through the grass, whispering through the open fields like a quiet hymn. He took off his hat, letting the air touch his face, and whispered, "For every broken thing that learns to stand again." Ashen snorted softly, tail flicking. Together they walked back into the warmth of the barn, the door closing gently behind them. And somewhere far beyond the hills, in the wide silence of Texas night, the river began to sing again. If this story touched you, tell me what part stayed with you the most. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply say, "I'm still here." And if you'd like to walk with me through more stories like this, about second chances, quiet courage, and the bond between man and horse, make sure to subscribe and stay for the next one.